of the school by making a donation. Our online lectures, but not seminars, are also transmitted live on our YouTube channel, and you can register to our channel by visiting the link you find on the chat. Today, our Sunday lecture is by Tom Bree, entitled Dante's Journey in Gothic Cathedral Design. We will have a special Thursday event next week on the 22nd of April in honor of Earth Day with Mary Abdil. So please check our newsletter for the specific times and details. Next Sunday, we will have our monthly appointment with the Healing Circle facilitated by myself on April 25th. And if you would like to participate or wish to include a name in our healing book, please send an email to eustheosophy@gmail.com. We will also have a lecture on Sunday by Keith Pritzker on The Secret Doctrine, A Timeless Guide to Self-Discovery, Part 2. As you all know, the European School of Theosophy has undertaken the mammoth task of reprinting the entire contents of Lucifer magazine divided into topics. Lucifer was a monthly journal founded in September 1887 by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, which ran until August 1897, when its name was changed to the Theosophical Review. This task involves compiling around 15,000 pages to be published under selected topics as the Lucifer Collection, which will be divided into the Blavatsky years and the post-Blavatsky years. This is as large as the entire collected writings of Madame Blavatsky, edited by Boris Dzirkov. Now, following the first volume in the Lucifer Collection, which was the Blavatsky years poetry, aphorisms, and proverbs, hot off the presses is the second volume entitled The Last Song of the Swan, with the much anticipated editorials from 1887 to 1891, written by HPB for her Lucifer magazine. This is truly a unique volume of her writings and a must-have for your library that you can order now from Amazon. We are also happy to inform you that the third volume, The Blossom and the Fruit, as well as volume 4, The Talking Image of Urur, of which even I do not have a copy yet, are also available on Amazon and are waiting for you to purchase them and read them. Our work continues on volume 5, which will be Dreams, Visions, and Tales of Wonder, and also on volume 6, Ghost, Vampire, and Strange Tales, which is underway. The way today's meeting will be conducted is that your microphones will be muted and you will not be able to unmute yourself. After the lecture, if you would like to ask a question, you can either write it in the chat or use the raise hand icon option. Your microphone will then be unmuted so that you can ask your question. If you need to leave the conference room during the lecture, please do so without announcing it on the chat, so as not to disturb the proceedings. And thank you for listening. Now, it is my honor to introduce our speaker today, Tom Bree. Tom is a geometer, artist, teacher, and writer. He studied the practice of sacred geometry at the Prince's School of Traditional Arts under Professor Keith Critlaw between 2001-2003. He has since taught classes in practical geometry and philosophy at the Prince's School, as well as many other organizations and institutes, both in the UK, where he lives, and internationally. For the past 10 years, Tom has been analysing the underlying design of the first English Gothic cathedral in relation to the quadruple arts of geometry, cosmology, musical ratios, and arithmetic. He is soon to publish a long-awaited book on the subject in 2021, which will demonstrate the importance of cosmic myth and the ascent of the soul within medieval Christian ideas. The book will also contain a detailed description of the design theory itself that embodies this mythos. So thank you for being with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing about Dante's journey in Gothic cathedral design. So let me pass the word over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. Thanks for the introduction. Now, this talk that I'm going to give today, it leads on from the one that I gave a few weeks ago, or at least part of what I mentioned a few weeks ago about the association of planet Venus with death and resurrection. That's a really key theme that I'm going to go into today. But as the title of the talk suggests, what I'm wanting to point out is that the journey associated with Dante's poem Commedia, the Italian poet Dante who wrote the Divine Comedy, that journey is one that seems to also be within the design of the first English Gothic cathedral. Now, I think I'll just go straight to the slides, so I'll share my screen and I'll let the images do some of the speaking. Now, can you see my opening panel, Juliet? Does that come up? Wait.
Yes, that's fine. Perfect.
Okay, thanks. So what you're looking at in this image is what you see when you first go in the west door of Wells Cathedral. It's a very beautiful cathedral. It's really renowned as one of the most beautiful in the UK. And what you're actually looking at, interestingly, however beautiful it is a journey in one sense through the underworld, or at least this first part of the cathedral is that, as we'll see once I get going on the journey. Now, let me go to the first image so I can talk a bit about Dante again. Now, I assume that you're aware to some degree of the Divine Comedy. Maybe you know it well, maybe you haven't heard of it at all. It's a journey that Dante takes, and he describes it in his poem, The Divine Comedy. Now, the thing about the journey is that it has these three stages, and it's these three stages which I suppose could be described as different geocosmic coordinates within one overarching journey. These are the three things, these three stages, which I think are present in the design of the first English Gothic cathedral. Now, the thing of interest here is that this cathedral is the Cathedral of St Andrews in the city of Wells in Somerset. The cathedral was designed 150 years prior to Dante writing Commedia. So what I'm assuming that suggests is that there was a recognition of this journey of the soul, which Dante externalized in his poem, but it was something that had already been going on within some sort of Christian practice of the mysteries for some time already. Now, you can see in this image in the bottom left, this is the Inferno, the first stage that Dante has to go through, where he has to descend into the underworld, to the center of the earth, in fact. And then behind him, there's the mountain of Purgatory, which is the movement up to the Garden of Eden. That's the second stage. And then finally, the journey through the planetary spheres, which you can see above the mountain of Purgatory there. Now, this whole journey is, of course, in emulation of Christ, because in Easter week, Christ, after dying on the cross, descends into the underworld for what's known as the Harrowing of Hell. And you could say that when he rises up, there is this resurrection in an Edenic state. And then finally, later on, there's the ascension. So this, in one sense, is following a Christian storyline, but of course, the storyline itself is perennial and pre-Christian. And so it's one that naturally came into Christianity in the sense of Christianity having some of the perennial storyline within its own particular storyline. Now, in these images, you can see the ground plan on the right, and then you can hopefully see in that aerial view of the cathedral how the ground plan is showing itself there. So the trip actually in to the west door is this beginning of the first stage. Now, the second stage, as we'll see, is up towards the east end of the cathedral, because in between that, there is actually a choir, which is the same shape and size as the Temple of Solomon. But more about that shortly once I get going. So we can begin at the west front, at the west door. And the first thing that happens with this journey is that we begin on Palm Sunday. So Palm Sunday is a week before Easter Sunday. and Palm Sunday is the day that Christ enters Jerusalem. So what we have in this image here, the west front of the cathedral, is in one sense the holy city of Jerusalem, but in another sense also an image of the heavenly Jerusalem, which is entered at the end of time. Now there is an enactment of this within the liturgy on Palm Sunday, and it still happens to this day, where everyone begins outside of the west front at the door there with the double portal. And when you see a double portal in a Gothic cathedral, it looks most likely to be an image of the Golden Gate, because the Golden Gate of Jerusalem, where Christ entered on Palm Sunday, also has two doorways. So when you have this on the west door of a cathedral, it's emulating this particular entry into Jerusalem. Now, on top of that, Gothic cathedrals tend to have three doorways, the main one in the middle and two side doors. And so that's an image of three of the doorways that you have on each side of the heavenly Jerusalem. So in one sense, there's an entry into Jerusalem down here on earth, but in another sense, an entry into the heavenly Jerusalem, which has descended to earth at the end of time. So this journey through the cathedral is Palm Sunday, which you can see at the west front on the left, but it progresses through the 8 days of Easter until reaching Easter Sunday at the East End. Now, the Lady Chapel at the East End, that's the one that I showed you in the talk a few weeks ago as having the shape of a pentagram. I'll come to that shortly. Now, another feature of this design of Wales Cathedral is that it very closely emulates the type of cosmological symbolism that underlies a modern day Freemason lodge room. So this is what I'm going to talk about first. Before I talk about the Dante-esque aspects of this journey, I'm going to show you how the layout is very similar to what you find in a Freemason lodge room. Now, some of these lines that I've put on here, I'm going to begin on the left. Now, you can see that the rectangle of the nave, so that's the first place that you enter into, that's the place that I showed you in the photo at the very beginning. I've put a circle around that rectangle, and what I need you to do is to imagine that that circle is planet Earth, or a profile view of planet Earth. So you have the North Pole at the top and the South Pole at the bottom. Now, the particular type of rectangle that nave is has a diagonal of 23.4 degrees, which is the axial tilt of Earth. So what this actually means is that the north wall and the south wall of the nave, these two lines here, are in the same position within that circle as the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. Now, of course, the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn relate to the solstices, because when the sun is closest to the Tropic of Cancer, that's the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere, and when it's closest to the Tropic of Capricorn, that's the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. Now, of course, what this means then is that the middle path of the cathedral is the equinox. Now, with Easter in mind, Easter is calculated as being the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. So Easter is very specifically an equinoctial festival. Now, the middle path through the nave is the walk along that equinoctial path, whereas you could say that the side aisles are the solstitial pathways. Now, let me just show a few images of this planet Earth geometry. Now, I'll fade in an image very slowly, and you can see how what I'm saying about the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. So if you make a rectangle using the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn as the two long edges of that rectangle, then you have the rectangle which is the nave at Wales Cathedral. Now, this rectangle, geometrically speaking, is one that has a short edge of 13 and a long edge of 30. So that type of rectangle has a diagonal of 23.4 degrees, which is the axial tilt of Earth. So we begin our journey on the Earth. But as we'll see shortly, there is actually a journey through the Earth, just like Dante, in emulation of Christ. Now, moving further east from there, the long blue rectangle there is the choir, which is, of course, the heart of a cathedral. And as I said earlier, the shape and size of that choir is the same as the Temple of Solomon. It's a 1x3 rectangle, 20 by 60 cubits. Now, also on top of that, the Temple of Solomon had its Holy of Holies in the west, so there's an inverse orientation of the Temple of Solomon in relation to a cathedral, because of course with a cathedral you progress eastwards through it, whereas with the Temple of Solomon you'd enter in the east and move westwards. Now, at the beginning of the temple, the doorway into the temple had pillars on either side of it, Yakin and Boaz, and there are two pillars in exactly the right position in Wells Cathedral at the eastern end of the choir. Now, these pillars are also very practical. They're holding up the whole of the eastern end of the cathedral, but they have various indications that suggest that they're also supposed to be Yakin and Boaz, because they're exactly half the height of the description of the pillars in the Bible. In the Bible, they're described as being 18 cubits, whereas these ones in Wells are 9 cubits. But they're also pentagonal in their cross section. And there's a description of the doorposts of the Temple of Solomon as being 5-sided. That's another biblical description. So at the heart of this cathedral, we have the Temple of Solomon. Now, moving further eastwards again, up into the Lady Chapel. Actually, before I do that, I'll just mention those two chapels, which you can see the feet of the pentagram are going down into two chapels. And those chapels are up at the far end of the two side aisles. Now, as I mentioned in relation to the nave, the side aisles symbolically resemble the solstitial pathways. So I suppose you could say the two paths on either side of the middle path. Now, they terminate in these two chapels, and these two chapels are dedicated to saints who are associated with the solstices. Now, this is a very Masonic feature, or something that you find in modern Freemasonry, which I think looks very much as if it's coming from medieval Christian cosmic symbolism. The two chapels, one is dedicated to John the Baptist, who has long been associated with Midsummer's Day. He's the summer solstice saint. Now, in Freemasonry, the winter solstice saint is the other John, John the Evangelist. But what happens here in the cathedral is that it's St. Stephen. Now, St. Stephen has a solstitial association in the church. He's the patron saint of horses, and this seems to be a Christianized remnant of a really ancient practice of horse sacrifice at the winter solstice. That's where the association appears to come. So you have these solstitial pathways that terminate in solstitial chapels. Now, the other thing about these two saints is that they're the last martyr before the Passion of Christ and the first martyr after the Passion of Christ. So again, you have this Passion association, which is the middle path of the cathedral, the journey from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday. And so to the Lady Chapel itself. This is what I showed you a few weeks ago. The east end is pentagonal. This is really what first got me started on all of my research, because I was aware that there's an association in the Western Church between the number 5 and the Virgin Mary. And the Lady Chapel is, of course, a chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The rosary beads are 5-fold, the rose is 5-fold, the Stella Matutina, the morning star, which is one of the titles of the Virgin Mary. That's I showed you last time about how Venus plots out the coordinates of a pentagram star. So up at the east end of the cathedral, we have this image of the morning star. Now, you'll remember, I also showed you this lodge room in a co-Freemasonry lodge in London, in Surbiton. It's the main lodge room of co-Freemasonry. And what you have on the east end wall of a Freemason lodge room is a pentagram-shaped light, which becomes illuminated as the initiate symbolically resurrects. Now, what you're looking at, I think I said before, is actually gold-coloured. These wings, they've just come out black in the image. This is the lodge room where they're from. This is Freemasonry for men and women in the same lodge room. So having a pentagram at the east end relating to resurrection is something that you can see both within this particular medieval Christian context, but also in a more recent Freemason context as well. So you can see this, I suppose, perennial cosmological symbolism informing both particular environments. Now, as the initiate resurrects, this is what is spoken in the third degree of initiation in Freemasonry. Be careful to perform your allotted task while it is yet day. Continue to listen to the voice of nature, which bears witness that even in this perishable frame resides a vital and immortal principle, which inspires a holy confidence that the Lord of life will enable us to trample the King of terrors beneath our feet and lift our eyes to that bright morning star, whose rising brings peace and salvation to the faithful and obedient of the human race. Now, of course, bright morning star is also associated with the risen Christ, and Christ describes himself as the bright morning star at the very end of the book of Revelation, at the very end of the Bible. And so again, there's this association of Venus rising in the east with resurrection, and that's what I'm going to go into quite a bit as we go into the Dante-esque part of the design, or the Dante-esque likeness in the design. I showed you this, I think, a few weeks ago as well. This is a geocentric diagram, a cosmological diagram showing how Venus moves around planet Earth. If you're imagining that you're floating above planet Earth as Earth goes around the sun, that would be how Venus moves in relation to you. It creates the fivefold symmetry because the relationship between the orbital period of Earth and the orbital period of Venus is virtually, well, it's very, very similar to a 13 to 8 relationship. And that's a Fibonacci approximation of the golden ratio. And the golden ratio naturally makes fivefold symmetry in geometric terms. So this is why this happens. There's a natural fivefold symmetry that's there in the mathematics. And it can be seen from a geocentric perspective as we're looking at it here, but also from a heliocentric perspective. So you can see it whichever way you look at it, and inevitably so because it's golden ratio mathematics. Now, rather amazingly, Venus also plots out the coordinates of an 8-pointed star as well. And if we're thinking about a pentagram and an octagram, 5 and 8, they're also consecutive Fibonacci numbers. 5, 8, 13 are consecutive Fibonacci numbers. And they're the 3 numbers that you have within this Earth-Venus geometry. So the fact that we have a pentagon, which is forming into a pentagram at the east end of the cathedral, it's interesting if we look at the western end of the chapel, that's clearly octagonal. Now, what you need to imagine is that this pentagram is sitting inside a circle that it's been traced within. If we now imagine the same type of circle being drawn from this point, the bottom corner of the pentagon. Now, if you look up at the top right-hand side of the screen, the octagram star there, that's what's going to fit inside this circle. And the circle, as I've said, is coming from here. Now, if you look at the blue star again on the top right-hand corner, I'm going to reduce it back to the octagon in the same way as the pentagram is reduced back to the pentagon. And then you can see how the chapel is very clearly a fusion of a pentagon and an octagon. It's 2 conjoined shapes. And so you have 3 edges of a pentagon and 5 edges of an octagon. And these are the 2 symmetries that are plotted out by the planet Venus. So as I say, the chapel is in one sense the Virgin Mary as the Stella Matutina, the morning star. She's the one who has the direct line of vision to the sun, which is below the horizon, but she shines or reflects the light of the sun down to here to the people who are looking from Earth. So she's the Queen of Heaven in this sense. But also Christ, the risen Christ, is also the bright morning star. And there's a boss in the middle of the ceiling of the Lady Chapel of the risen Christ, the risen and ascended Christ. So it has both of these symbols relating to the planet Venus. Now, a really key part of the symbolism of the planet Venus, and this is specifically something that I think is in medieval Christianity. There's variations of the story that have developed, and particularly if we're talking about Lucifer, I think the Lucifer magazine that Juliet was talking about at the beginning. The way I'm going to talk about Lucifer for the next part of the talk is very specifically from a medieval Christian viewpoint, and I think it's different in some of the later ways of looking at the symbolism. Now, the thing about planet Venus is that Venus, when we see her, is either rising up in the east just before sunrise, or setting in the west and then setting below the horizon. So Venus, planet Venus, is always in close proximity to the sun. And a lot of the time we should really be able to see Venus during the day, but because the sun blots out the starry sky, we can't see Venus. But Venus is very often there. But the only time that we can actually see Venus is when the sun is below the horizon. And so the sky isn't being sort of bleached out by the light of the sun. So we see her either rising in the east or setting in the west. Now, this has long been associated with a symbolism of rising up into heaven, and on the other hand, falling down into the earth, or going down into the earth, down into the underworld. Now, what you're looking at here is a diagram. If you look upon those two circles as being the orbital circles of Earth on the outside, and then Venus is the next one in, and then Mercury with the sun at the center. Now you see how there's the numbers 8 at the bottom, then 263 on either side, and 50 at the top. What you need to imagine is that Venus is moving faster than Earth. So as Venus is moving anti-clockwise in this diagram, Earth is also moving anti-clockwise. When Venus moves between Earth and the sun, that takes 8 days. So that's why 8 is written there. And we can't see Venus at this point because obviously the sun is so bright. So it takes 8 days for Venus to pass in front of the Earth until we then see her as the morning star on the right of the diagram. And we then see her as the morning star for 263 days. So in the morning, she'll be rising up into heaven just before the sun rises. Now, after those 263 days, there'll then be 50 days where we don't see Venus again because she's passing behind the sun. After that 50 days, we then see her on the other side of the sun, and that's when she's the evening star. So that's when we see her in the evening after sunset, setting herself. So this is that journey downwards, whereas the rising of the morning star is a journey upwards. So there's this natural counteraction of movement. And this is associated also with the soul and the two aspects of the soul. So for instance, Plotinus talks about Aphrodite as being the soul, and there being these two Aphrodites. In the dialogue, Plato's dialogue symposium, there are these two Aphrodites, Aphrodite Urania, the heavenly Aphrodite, and Aphrodite Pandemos, which is the earthly Aphrodite. So there's always this dual aspect with Venus. And the way in which this shows itself in Christianity is seemingly through the descent into the underworld and the ascent into heaven. So the thing that we have underlying the design is this solstitial, I suppose these two solstitial pathways, which are rather like where you have this idea of two opposite ways which balance off one another, and then very importantly the middle path that runs between them, rather like the Sushumna that the two serpents are on either side of. So there needs to be this middle path that's taken, because that's the one that leads to resurrection, whereas the two side chapels are both dedicated to martyrs, the last martyr before the Passion, the first martyr after the Passion. So they are death, whereas the one that goes beyond them to resurrection is the middle path that leads into the Lady Chapel and the rising of Venus in the east. So let's now look at how this relates to the journey that Dante goes on. Now, the first stage of Dante's journey is through the earth, from one side to the other. He begins his journey on the evening of Good Friday, and this is when he enters the underworld. So clearly what he's doing is an emulation of Christ's Paschal journey. So when Christ dies on the cross, he then goes down into the underworld for what's known as the Harrowing of Hell. Now here is Dante's journey. If you look at the bottom of that sphere of earth that's at the center there, you have Jerusalem, which is where he enters the underworld. And then you have an upside down funnel, which is the journey through the underworld that Dante takes. Now, the key thing that we need to remember with all this, because obviously it's a very rich storyline that Dante gives, but the thing that I want to point out, which we'll see shortly in the design of the cathedral, is that at the very center of the earth, which is the point that's furthest removed from the divine sphere, this is where Lucifer falls to. So as in medieval Christian Lucifer, who is the fallen angel. So the divine sphere is the one that's furthest out. The divine realm is furthest out beyond all of the planetary spheres. And at the very, very center of that is the center of the earth. And so that's the lowest frozen point, as it were. Now this image is by Botticelli, and this is that funnel now looked the other way around. So you can see Earth at the top there with the greenery, and then the movement down the funnel gradually becoming more and more constricted until reaching the center of the Earth, which is where Lucifer is, and that's completely frozen. So this medieval Christian character, Lucifer, the way he's described is taken from Isaiah. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. So the lowest depths of the pit, geocosmically speaking, is the center of the earth, and Sheol in the Hebrew tradition is the deathly underworld. Now, this story of Lucifer, the way it's understood in medieval Christianity is that Lucifer is the soul in its hubristic state. So it's attempting to raise its ego to the same level as the deity. And so the inevitable result of that is to fall down into the earth, to fall down into the underworld. So it's the beginning of the journey. The beginning of the journey is where the ego is bristling and rising, and it needs to, I suppose, learn some humility, perhaps. That's perhaps, I think, what's being said. This is what's said by people like Bernard of Clairvaux. There's this description of pride in relation to Lucifer, and the pride inevitably makes the soul fall down into the earth. Now, this storyline is clearly, even though the name Lucifer is used, which of course is morning star, very clearly it's talking about the whole journey of Venus, because it's saying, Isaiah is effectively saying, you may be rising at the moment and full of yourself, but later on in the year, you're going to be falling down. So it's rather like the Wheel of Fortune, this idea that you're very full of feeling great and glorious as you're rising up on the wheel, but then you reach the top and then you start to go down. So it's the inevitable downward movement that happens when the ego rises and tries to raise itself to the highest point. Now, the analogy that I'm going to draw here isn't with the whole of Dante's journey in relation to the cathedral ground plan that you're looking at on the left there, just planet Earth. So you have planet Earth as being this movement through the nave. Now, the mountain of Purgatory, which is at the top of planet Earth there, that's, as I'm going to say a bit later on, is this area here, up at the top of the cathedral, beyond the Temple of Solomon shaped ground plan of the choir. Now, as for the journey through the planetary spheres, I'll talk about that a bit later on. That requires a difference in direction. So here we are back in the nave again. And this, as I said, this is planet Earth. And so the journey through the nave is a journey through planet Earth, rather like Dante in his Divine Comedy. So here we have the central point of the nave. And as you can count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's 5 bays in. And then there's another 5 bays, 2, 3, 4, 5, beyond that central point. So if I count the bays here, you see these archways, that's the nave bay that's furthest up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this here is the middle pillar. And it's this area here. This is what I'm about to show you. This is a very interesting carving. If we look at the ground plan again, to the left, it's this pillar here, just immediately adjacent to the center of the earth, as it were. There's actually an image of Lucifer there. Now, the fascinating thing about this image of Lucifer, I mean, he has these animal features, such as the pointy animal ears and the goatee beard, but as you can see, he also has a serpentine crown and a serpentine form coming over the top of his head, and he has an eye-shaped hole in the brow of that crown. So this resembles the image of Lucifer that comes from the Grail storylines that are from exactly the same few decades as when the nave at Wells Cathedral was built. Now, as you can see, it's an empty eye-shaped hole because of that storyline in which when Lucifer falls from heaven, he loses the emerald from his crown. Now, of course, if we're talking about a crown with a singular gem in it, it's in the brow of the crown. So even though the description in Wartburg Krieg, which is the Grail storyline that has this description of the emerald lost from the crown, it specifically means the brow of the crown. So this is the sense of eternity lost by Lucifer when he falls from heaven. But of course, this is part of the journey that needs to be passed through before there can then be a movement back up from whence he came. Now, just around from that image of Lucifer, on the same pillar, there's this image here of a battle between this image on the left with a dragon on the right. And this appears to be part of that same storyline. This is actually the war in heaven, as it's described in the book of Revelation. This is another part of the storyline of Lucifer falling from heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Now, right on the opposite side of the pillar from where that image of Lucifer is, there are these two here, which I think are also, these are the angels that fell with Lucifer. Now, as you can see, they have the similar sort of animal ears to the image of Lucifer, but they're on exactly the opposite side of the pillar to Lucifer. So this first part of the journey through the earth to the center of the earth and then beyond, is what the nave, in one sense, what the nave seems to symbolize. Now, of course, the thing about this journey is that it does have two stages to it. And like I said to you, I think what I'm describing here is the medieval Christian version of it. So I think Lucifer is a slightly different character in Theosophy and other descriptions. Now, in the Christian storyline, it's specifically these two characters, and there's a counteraction between them in the sense that Lucifer first rises and then descends, and then Christ, as a counteraction, descends and then rises. But it's the same, you could say it's the same journey, really, with these two different characters. So in a sense, it's one overarching storyline, one overarching journey. Now, again, back to this idea of the need for humility before there can be any journey of ascent of the soul. This quote here from Matthew really sums up well what I'm describing here about this sort of counteraction of Christ after the story of Lucifer, because of course the story of Lucifer comes first and the story of Christ then is the counteraction that comes afterwards. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And so this is the necessary, I suppose, change that needs to happen in the soul if it's going to move any further in the spiritual path. There has to be a subduing of the lower part of the soul that is proud, that is full of itself, it makes an obstacle that stops us moving any further in the spiritual path. Now, here's one of the many images of the Harrowing of Hell. The story is actually mainly described in the Gospel of Nicodemus. Nicodemus is a Pharisee who's described in the Gospel of John. And as we'll see, just about everything that's talked about in relation to Nicodemus really relates to the underworld and the idea of dying and being reborn. Now, this idea of the necessary death that takes place in the underworld is, of course, the death of the lower self, so that there can be a rising up or a rebirth in spirit. Now, this is something that's experienced by Jonah, and Jonah's journey down into the underworld is there in the form of his being swallowed up by death itself, by the whale, which is actually described as being Sheol. Now, Christ also associates his journey through the underworld with the story of Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, this, of course, is an ancient idea. This is what you find in the story of Inanna, who is Venus in the Sumerian tradition. Inanna goes down into the underworld, experiences a death, and then is reborn in the east as the morning star. So this is the same perennial storyline also showing itself in the Christian storyline too. So it's not that it's new in Christianity, of course. This is a reenactment in Christian form of something that's been around for a long, long time. In the Jewish tradition, it's the humility that necessarily comes from Jonah going down into the whale. And he's vomited back up. There's no rising of the morning star with Jonah. He's literally vomited up onto the beach by the whale once he's learnt to do what God has asked of him. Because, of course, Jonah was asked to go and preach to the people of Nineveh, and he ran away from God. But he was eventually found at the bottom of the boat. And when people knew that the storm that the boat was experiencing was because Jonah was running away from God, he was thrown overboard and swallowed up by death itself. Now, if there's one person from this part of the world where I'm speaking from, I'm in the UK, if there's one person who just seemed really surely to have been involved in some sort of culture of initiation, it would be the person known as the Gawain poet, who wrote Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, really interestingly, another of the poems associated with him, Patience, which is about Jonah and the whale, he actually describes going into a cathedral as being the journey into the whale. So you have this association of the journey into the underworld associated with the movement into a cathedral. He knows that he has gone from the ship into the water and been taken by a whale straight down its throat, like a speck of dust through the door of a great cathedral, so huge was its mouth. Now, this is the only other description I've ever come across of the idea of the doorway to a cathedral being a doorway to the underworld, the deathly underworld. So it's fascinating that it would come from the Gawain poet, who, with his storylines, you can see very clearly he's involved in some sort of esoteric tradition. Now, the Harrowing of Hell, let's look at what a harrow is. A harrow, as you may know, is one of those things in the image there, something that gets dragged along the ground. It's a rather harrowing experience for the earth, because it's a cage type thing that just gets dragged along the ground, and it's to refine the earth. It's to make the earth more, I suppose, appropriate for receiving the seed, which can then grow. It gets rid of the large clods of earth. And I suppose you could say that the beginning of any spiritual path requires the breaking up of the large clods of ego and pride that create these obstacles in the way forward. So the necessary stage is the harrowing of hell, the preparation of the soul before there can be any ascent. Now, here's that rather beautiful description of this necessary death from the Gospel of John. Unless a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. So there needs to be this death so that there can then be a resurrection. Now, this next quote is one that's associated with Nicodemus, the Pharisee. Now, Nicodemus, he's the one who prepares Christ's body immediately before the harrowing of hell. And it's the Gospel of Nicodemus, which has the storyline of the harrowing of hell within it. Now, this is what Christ says to Nicodemus. Nicodemus also goes to meet Christ at night time. So again, we have this idea of darkness. Unless a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus said unto him, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? So again, this is very clearly part of this whole symbolism of the journey downwards to a necessary death so that there can then be a resurrection. Now, just briefly, I'm going to take a sidestep I'm going to stay with the idea of the underworld, but looking at it through a different focus. This, as you might be aware, is the Chartres Labyrinth, the labyrinth in Chartres Cathedral. Now, interestingly, the labyrinths in the French Gothic cathedrals are always around the centres of the nave. So, of course, this is the same area in Wells Cathedral where the image of Lucifer is. Now, the other thing about these labyrinths is that they pretty much always have an association with the Minotaur storyline. In 12th century Christianity, there was a great openness and embracing of a lot of ancient wisdom traditions, particularly at places like the School of Chartres. So there wasn't such a puritanical view within Christianity at that time. There was a much more open view. It's known as the 12th century Renaissance. There was lots of knowledge and wisdom coming in from various different sources. Now, as I'm going to show you, the Chartres type of labyrinth in the various different places where you see it always has an association with the Minotaur storyline. And of course, the story of the Minotaur in the maze is, again, a journey down to the lowest place to confront, I suppose you could say, a lower aspect of the soul that needs to be brought to order or needs to be vanquished or subdued. Now, this, of course, is what you find at the center of a Roman labyrinth. So the Christian labyrinths are clearly emulating the Roman use of the labyrinth, which always has an image of Theseus fighting the Minotaur at the center of them. And so this journey in the labyrinth is clearly a journey downwards into the underworld for, I suppose, a confronting of a particular aspect of the self that needs to be dealt with before there can be any progress. Now, the ground plan on the left is Chartres, and the ground plan on the right is Amiens. They're both Notre Dame cathedrals. The Octagonal Labyrinth at Amiens is effectively the same pathway route as the one at Chartres. Now, both of these are associated with the Minotaur storyline. There's supposedly a metal plate at the center of the Chartres Labyrinth that depicted the combat between Theseus and the Minotaur, whereas with the Amiens Labyrinth, that's described in a medieval document as the House of Daedalus. And of course, Daedalus is the one who builds the labyrinth for King Minos of Crete. So both of these are associated with the Minotaur storyline. This is a smaller finger labyrinth, which is on one of the pillars just outside Lucca Cathedral in Tuscany. Now you see there's, on the same stone as the labyrinth, there's some engraving there with writing, and this is what the writing says. This is the labyrinth built by Daedalus of Crete. All who entered therein were lost, save Theseus, thanks to Ariadne's thread. Now, this story of the Minotaur is again associated with lust and pride, these two particular aspects, because the reason why the Minotaur comes into being is because Poseidon gives a white bull to King Minos, and he specifically gives it to him so it can be sacrificed to Poseidon. Now, Minos likes the look of the bull and decides not to, and he sacrifices one of his other bulls. So Poseidon, in his fury, he gets King Minos' wife, Pasiphae, to fall in lust with the bull, and then the conception of the Minotaur happens. So in that sense, the Minotaur is an embodiment of the pride of Minos for not doing or for not following the divine command, and then the lust of Pasiphae. And these two things are why the Minotaur exists. And so in that sense, the initiate has to go down into their labyrinthine soul to find those aspects of the soul that need to be brought to order or subdued or risen above, as it were. So you can see how there is a direct analogy of this pre-Christian storyline with what you then find in the Christian storyline, the medieval Christian storyline of Lucifer. Now, here's another example. This is from 1500s by the master of the Campana Cassoni. Now, you can see this is the Chartres Labyrinth sort of pulled up into a third dimension, so it has walls. And in the middle, you have a chivalric knight fighting the Minotaur. Now, of course, chivalry, you can see by its very nature, very clearly that's some sort of a spiritual path as well. It's not just some outward mode of conduct in court. Chivalry, by its very name, it's the horseman, the one who has to learn how to subdue or learn to, I suppose, control the horse rather than the horse being in control of the horseman. Now, of course, this is what has to happen before the heavenly female can then come into the view, because of course that's what also you find in chivalry and courtly love, the heavenly female guide, and that's what we'll see later on happens with Dante and his journey of ascent. Now, the last image of a Chartres type of labyrinth is this one on the Hereford Map Mundi. So this is in Hereford Cathedral, this particular map. What you're looking at the top of this map is Asia, and at the very far east, so at the very top of the map, this is the Garden of Eden here, which I'll show you a close-up of a little later. So Eden is in the east. This is Asia, this is Europe, and this is Africa. So we have Mediterranean Sea here. Now here is the island of Crete, which is where, of course, the Minotaur storyline happens. And on the island of Crete, you have, again, the Chartres labyrinth. So very clearly, the Chartres type of labyrinth, which is depicted in various different places, always has a Minotaur association. So in a similar way, when you're going through a nave of a French Gothic cathedral with a labyrinth, there is this journey down into the underworld as the first stage of the journey of initiation. Now, this symbolism of Venus rising in the east and setting in the west very clearly also goes hand in hand with Serpentine symbolism. In medieval Christianity, as I described in that quote from Revelation, Lucifer is described as both a serpent and a dragon, and he has the serpentine crown with the mouth of the serpent being where the gem, the emerald, is missing. But the one that isn't talked about so much is the fact that Christ is also the ascending serpent. So you have both the downward movement, rather like the setting of Venus in the west, but also the ascending movement of the rising in the east. Now, the description of Christ as the ascending serpent is associated with the Old Testament story of Moses raising the serpent in the wilderness. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. So there's a direct allegorical association of Christ with the ascending serpent, which again, of course, is the counteraction of the descending serpent. There has to be, the serpent has to raise itself back up into heaven. Now, this is an Orthodox Christian crozier. And one of the features of Orthodox croziers, or at least some of them, is that they have this very caduceus-like appearance. They have these serpents on them. Now, this is understood in the Orthodox Church as being Christ as the ascending serpent. So this is the ascending serpent of the resurrection. Now, really interestingly, this is the crozier of one of the main bishops who built Wells Cathedral. Now, this also has the large overarching serpent, but what's depicted in the middle of that is, of course, the war in heaven. So that's St. Michael fighting against the dragon. So you have both sides of this serpentine storyline within this crozier of Bishop Jocelyn. Now, there's a local story here in Wales of Bishop Jocelyn fighting a dragon. There's a place called Worminster, just out in the countryside, a few miles outside Wales, where the storyline is based. And of course, Worminster, the name is from the worm, which is from the Anglo-Saxon word for serpent. So we have both the downward movement of the serpent and the upward movement of the serpent, all within this one crozier image. So with now ascent in mind, let's look at the next stage of Dante's journey, which is the journey up the mountain of purgatory, but more specifically, the point that I'm going to show here at Wells is an ascent to Eden, because the Lady Chapel also seems to have an association with Eden. Now, I showed you a little earlier this image of the Hereford Map Mundi. This here, this circle in the far east is Eden, because of course Eden is in the east. Now there you have the 4 rivers running from Eden. That's the close-up of the Garden of Eden image in the Hereford Map Mundi. So the Lady Chapel being in the far east of the cathedral is also to do with the fact that it is Eden in the east. But of course, Eden is to do, relates to springtime and also morning time. And so morning time is, of course, when the sun rises and when the bright morning star rises too. So there's this whole connection of symbols with the Garden of Eden, sunrise. When Dante enters the Garden of Eden, he enters it at sunrise. So there's very specifically this association of the beginnings, springtime as well, with Eden and the Far East. Now, also the association of the thornless rose. The Virgin Mary is known as the rose with no thorns. And the rose with no thorns is essentially the soul that has returned to Eden. Because in very early Christianity, there's the idea that the rose grew in Eden, but without thorns. And so when there was the fall of the soul, when the fall of humanity happened, that's when the rose started to grow thorns. Now, this looks very much like rose symbolism in pre-Christian times as well. In Apuleius's Metamorphoses, Lucius, who has become turned into an ass, he makes himself, or he becomes a human again through eating the rose petals from the priests of Isis. And Isis, of course, there's so many linked symbols of the Virgin Mary with Isis. So this is another one of these perennial symbols that comes through into Christianity. So the rose being associated with a return to Eden, or a return to one's true state. Now, this also shows itself with the Hortus Conclusus, the enclosed garden. So this is an Edenic garden, which is, I suppose you could say, the soul that is completely empty, the soul that is in a state of kenosis. And this is really what the Virgin Mary represents in Christianity. She's the soul that is completely empty and virginal. Now, this is very similar to what you find in Islam with the Prophet Muhammad being unlettered. He's uneducated. He doesn't have a worldly education. So therefore, he's able to receive the divine learning of the Quran. And then the Quran is essentially the Islamic equivalent of Christ. Christ is the word made flesh. The Quran is the word made book. This is an idea you find in Sufism, in Islamic mysticism. Now, that is the Lady Chapel. So this idea of the thornless rose as well. There's this garland of roses going around the Lady Chapel like that, rather like a set of rosary beads. Now, I said a bit earlier about sunrise and springtime. These are sort of connected symbols. Sunrise is the beginning of the day, or when the light arises in the daytime, and springtime is when the light arises in the annual cycle. So they're equivalent moments, you could say, one in the day, one in the annual cycle. And they both relate symbolically to the east. And of course, that relates naturally to the emergence of light. And so this movement through the cathedral culminates up at the east end with the ascent to Eden and the rising of the bright morning star and the return to Eden. Now, really interestingly, there's a geocosmic description of this state in John Milton's Paradise Lost, which obviously is a few hundred years after the building of Wales Cathedral. Now, what John Milton says about Eden, or prior to the fall, is that there was no equator ecliptic angle. So the axial tilt of Earth wasn't present before the fall. So if that was the case, if we applied that idea to Wales Cathedral, that would mean that there'd be none of the cathedral except for the middle path. Because what would happen if there was no equator ecliptic angle is that the equator of Earth would always be close to the sun. There wouldn't be this seasonal fluctuation between light and dark. So it would. So there's an interesting reflection of that in John Milton's description, Paradise Lost. This idea of eternal spring, eternal equinox, as being there as a geocosmic principle. So that's the description of Inferno and Purgatorio, the first two stages of Dante's journey. First, there's a journey through the earth, through the center of the earth, and then there's the journey of ascent to Eden. And in the middle of this, of course, you have the choir, which is the same shape and size as the Temple of Solomon. Now, the ascent through the heavens, we have to change direction, because that seems to be an ascent northwards. Now, the idea of an ascent into the heaven being one that goes northwards relates to the idea of the Virgin Mary as the Stella Maris. The Stella Maris is the star of the sea. Now, the Stella Maris is the point in the sky in the north that all the stars move around in an anti-clockwise motion. So the ascent to the eighth heaven, beyond the seven planetary spheres, is inevitably one that would be moving northwards. So you see the Lady Chapel, the chapter house, which is on the north side of the cathedral, so above the rest of the cathedral as we're now looking at it. That seems to be the place which is ascended to. This is the celestial rose that Dante reaches just before he becomes one with God. Now, interestingly, the place that Lucifer aspires to reach before he falls down into the underworld is the mount on the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. So this idea of the north as being the highest point is one that you find within that story of Lucifer within medieval Christianity. But as I say, the celestial rose seems to be what we have with this mandala-shaped chapter house on the north side of the cathedral. It has a rose-like appearance in that mandala form. Now, at the center of the celestial rose in Dante's Paradiso, the third stage of Dante's poem, he reaches this rose, and all the petals of this rose are of the saints. But at the center of it, you have the Virgin Mary, who is, I suppose, the saint of saints. And so the Virgin Mary is at the center of that rose, rather like the Virgin Mary being the Stella Maris, who is at the center of that circular movement of the stars overhead. So this journey northwards is one that is orientated towards the Stella Maris up in the 8th heaven. Now there is, interestingly, an association of the rose with the chapter house. When you look at various of the chapter houses in England, there's this inscription. This one is in York Minster. There's also one in the Westminster Abbey chapter house as well. Ut rosa flos florum sic est domus ista demorum, which is, as the rose is the flower of flowers, so this is the house of houses. So there is this direct association of a rose, and of course a very high symbolism in terms of how this is being talked about. So the chapter house, even though it's not consecrated, is a very high place. It's not consecrated because it's not part of the liturgical process. But clearly, and obviously when you just look at the architecture and the amount of time and money it would have needed to build, the chapter houses are very significant places in terms of their symbolism. Now here is the beautiful rose-like vault in the York Minster Lady Chapel, or sorry, chapter house. And here's the wonderful vault in the Wells chapter house. Now these two cathedrals are ones I've been looking at. I've also been looking at the one at Southwell as well. And one of the reasons why I've been looking at them is because they all have this octagonal chapter house on the north side of the building. Now at the one in Southwell, the one you're looking at here, it's full of green men. It's full of people who are exuding this greenness. I think people for whom the morning star has risen in their heart, and so they're full of this greenness that's issuing forth from them. I mean, I do think green men are an image of a particular state of soul, and they're connected with a really ancient tradition associated with St. George and someone who's known as Al-Qidda in Islam and Elijah in Judaism. It relates really to the old tradition of Baal. I won't go into that now. I haven't got the time to go into that. Now, here's why I'm looking at these three cathedrals, because they all have this octagonal chapter house on the north side of the building. So as you're progressing eastwards, to your left, there's this rose-type image on the north side of the building. Now, one of the reasons why I've taken an interest in this is because of this image here. This image is, you could say it's the most important stained glass image in Laon Cathedral. Laon in France is one of the main places where the 7 liberal arts were studied. And Adelard of Bath, who I think possibly has a hand with the design of Wells Cathedral, he was a teacher at Laon. Now you can see how significant this rose is that the Virgin Mary is holding up on her north side, as it were, if we're looking upon her as being the ground plan of a cathedral. Christ is looking up to this rose. He's not looking up to her face, he's looking up to the rose. And of course, in this particular image, the Virgin Mary is the seat of wisdom, the Cedes Sapientiae. So in one sense, she is the seat of Christ, the seat of wisdom, but in another sense, the way in which wisdom was depicted in the medieval Western Church was as a female enthroned, because wisdom in the Old Testament tradition is female. So you could say that wisdom has given birth to herself in that sense. So this image on the right, this is Laon Cathedral, and you can see that rose window right up at the east end, and at the very centre of that rose window, that's where there's this image of the Virgin Mary. So it's not any old image of the Virgin, it's a very, very elevated image. It's the most important stained glass image in the cathedral, you could say, because it's at the centre of the mandala in the east. Now, this idea of the Virgin Mary as the Stella Maris, I want to finish off with a prayer that was written by the Knights Templar during the time that they were being persecuted, just before the Knights Templar were dissolved. Now, bearing in mind that the Stella Maris is the central point of the stars that are moving in their circular movement up in the 8th heaven, beyond the 7 planetary spheres, this invocation of the Knights Templar is to the Stella Maris. May the grace of the Holy Spirit be present with us. May Mary, Star of the Sea, lead us to the harbour of salvation. Now, this idea of a journey across, I suppose you could say, across the 7 planetary seas, which leads to the harbour of salvation in the 8th heaven, is one that I think is very clearly there with the symbolism of the Templars and also with Dante. Now, I can go into that more in another talk, but one final thing to show in relation to the Templars is, I think, something I showed you in the last talk as well. If we look upon the ground plan of the choir as being the same size as the Temple of Solomon, which it is, and then there's an octagonal chapter house to the north of it, which relates to the idea of an ascent, then what we have on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is where the Knights Templar were based, and when the Templars were there, it was known as the Temple of Solomon. And immediately to the north, the Dome of the Rock, which was made into a church during the Crusader kingdom. So you have an octagonal building, which of course is associated with ascent in the Islamic tradition. It became associated with the story of Jacob's Ladder when the Christians were there, interestingly, even though there's no description of Jacob's Ladder in Jerusalem. But this storyline of ascent became associated with the octagonal Islamic shrine. So you have this association in this sense with the Templars, with the choir at the heart of the cathedral. Now, the Templars are associated, of course, with Freemasonry. They're also associated with Dante. And so it does look as if there's some sort of a symbolic nod in the direction of the Templars within the whole of this journey that we've been going on in this talk. Here comes the book plug. Now, you can read all about this. There's a great deal more than I've just said. I've just really given one particular aspect of it. There's a lot more. And of course, there's a lot going on with the geometry of the ascent up to the chapter house. I haven't really shown any of that in this talk. But if you're interested in buying the book, I'm just actually laying it out at the moment. So it should be hopefully published in, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 months, maybe even less than that. I'm not sure. But just write an email to the email address there, the Cosmos in Stone. That's the name of the book, the Cosmos in Stone @gmail.com. And all you need to do at this point is write a message saying that you're interested in pre-ordering. And then when I set up the pre-ordering, which I'll do in a month or 2, I'll get back in contact with you, and then you can make a pre-order then. I'm hoping that it'll be £18. It's going to be a very big book, very thick, but I'm going to do it at quite a good price because I'm more interested in spreading the word really than anything else. So thank you very much for listening, and